So in this video, we're going to talk about a variety of political processes and terms, the most important of which is probably the idea of sovereignty. So we talked about kind of what it takes to be a state the other day and what the term state means, kind of interchangeable with country in this class and in many political science classes. So we're going to add some more terms into the list and talk a little bit more about the functioning of states. So the first term to introduce is the idea of sovereignty. So sovereignty means the legal independence from control of its internal and foreign affairs by other states, right? So this is kind of a legal concept and essentially has the idea of sort of legal status or legal recognition or independence. So anything that you can consider to be a state, or like we often call them countries, would have sovereignty, right? So the United States, France, Japan, Kyrgyzstan, all of those would be states that have sovereignty. And what I think is interesting are sort of the non-examples here. So places that are colonies, so like Bermuda for the United Kingdom, would be a colony of the United Kingdom, therefore not have sovereignty. Individual sub-state units, so in the United States, we call those states, right? So that makes everything confusing in this class. But they would not have legal sovereignty. Other types of sub-state units, like provinces in Canada, fall into the same category. All right, and closely related is the idea of self-determination. So really, these two terms mean a lot of they're used fairly interchangeably. Self-determination just means the concept that nations have the right to govern themselves. So I would say the distinction is that self-determination is used in a little bit more of a practical sense, in that like sovereignty has more of a legalistic idea, right? So self-determination, I would say, the example that I have is about 10 years ago in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, there was a referendum for basically a yes or no vote on whether or not to leave and become their own country. And this was a decision that's based on kind of the idea of should we have self-determination, right? So that is sort of connected, I think. All right, so worth mentioning a few places. We're going to talk about Palestine and Taiwan specifically in this sort of discussion of states and statehood. But just wanted to talk a little bit about sovereignty and give you some examples. So this is kind of interesting. There were two different maps kind of by the US government last year, I think. And one of them had Taiwan as its own country, not filled in as the rest of, of China. And another one, I think from the CDC, had Chinese Taipei or Taiwan kind of highlighted as part of China. So you oftentimes, whether or not other countries recognize Taiwanese sovereignty is always sort of a hot topic. The United States officially does not, but in a de facto way does have ways to recognize the self-determination of Taiwan. This gets a little bit tricky and again gets between the two kind of legal versus practical sense of how countries function. So that's kind of an example. And this is an interesting example. We're going to talk about Palestine, but the sort of general sovereignty or the countries that recognize Palestine as a state internationally, or internationally sort of recognize the sovereignty of Palestine as a country. So this is an interesting map that we'll talk more about in class. All right, so part of how countries function oftentimes there are parts of country that are actually given more autonomy or local control than the rest of the country. So an autonomous region is defined as an area of a state that has a degree of autonomy or has freedom from external authority. So autonomous regions are really tricky, I think, because there are a various degree of autonomy that sort of depends on the country itself or the state itself, right? So you might have a place that actually has a lot of local control or local autonomy that essentially sort of runs itself. So many of the parts of Russia, like Chechnya or Dagestan, some kind of breakaway sort of republics that are still technically part of Russia, but actually exercise a good degree of sort of their own local power. And then you have other places that essentially, because they are sort of in a part of the country that the government sort of lacks capacity to control, are considered to be autonomous. So an example of that might be a place like Somaliland in in East Africa. And then there are some regions that are called autonomous regions, but that's kind of a name only, and that they are not actually that autonomous. So the example for this would be China, which has 5 autonomous regions. most notably Tibet and Xinjiang in Western China. And these areas of the country actually have a lot more government sort of intervention and political crackdowns and limits on political freedom than the rest of the country. So they are called autonomous regions sort of officially in their names, but are not actually autonomous that much. So that's hard to make sense of. But we do see that kind of interesting official versus reality distinction here. And the map on the right has to do with the region of Kurdistan, which is in northern Iraq and parts of Syria, and Iran, and Turkey. And Kurdistan is interesting because sometimes it's referred to as autonomous, and sometimes it's referred to as sort of this other term that we have called semi-autonomous region. So this is an area where a group has some degree of political autonomy, some type of political autonomy, sort of less than what we would say in an autonomous region. Another state sort of inarguably controls the region, but they do have sort of limited political powers. So a good example or a classic example of semi-autonomous regions are Native American reservations in the US. Kurdistan, sometimes referred to as autonomous, sometimes semi-autonomous. I think that the distinction is really tricky. There's not really like a clear distinction between what makes an autonomous region versus a semi-autonomous region. I think it's sort of more of a matter of semantics. And I think the more important point is that levels of autonomy can sort of vary from place to place. But I do think we see with kind of the Native American reservation that, the general idea that you have sort of areas delegated within the borders of another country that are given more political powers sort of legally within the Constitution. And that is what we see with Native Americans in the United States. And here are the Native American reservation maps in the state of Washington. So this is because of the term of tribal sovereignty, which refers to the right of American Indians and Alaska Natives to govern themselves. So the U.S. Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as sort of distinctive governments in the same way that they recognize foreign governments, and give those governments the same powers to regulate their own internal affairs that they do other forms of state and local governments. Although we know sort of this, there is a very complicated history between the U.S. and various Native American tribes in terms of their dealings, right? Not always fair, and not always dealing with them sort of in a co-equal way. But this is sort of the legal principle that at least establishes this degree of semi-autonomy that exists in the United States for Native American tribes. All right, thanks. Bye.